Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Previously, we talked about these 6 characteristics of animals. That is, all animals are eukaryotic, multicellular living things that are mobile, except for the sponges. They are heterotrophs with some mechanism for digesting the food, and they have other adaptations for protection and support. And all share a very similar beginning. So these are characteristics that are shared by all animals. But nevertheless, one wonders how to subclassify this vast array of different types of living things. How do we go about figuring out who belongs with whom? Well, that is the task for today. If you recall, we had arranged the 6 kingdoms like this. As is suggested by this diagram, it is believed that bacteria gave rise to protists, that is, protists evolved from some bacteria, and then the protists developed into the fungi, the plant, and the animal kingdom. Thus, it is suggested long time ago that some protists evolved into the first primitive animals. So the bacteria evolved into protists, and then the protists evolved into the animal kingdom. There's one particular protist, this one that you see before you, the choanoflagellates, that are thought to be the ancestors of the animal kingdom. Because this particular protist demonstrates an ability to form colonies. In other words, it tends to huddle together like this and make colonies. And these colonies would evolve into the animal kingdom. Thus, this choanoflagellate, this particular protist, is very special because, at least from our current theory, it gave rise to the animal kingdom. The diagram before you here suggests the evolutionary tree, sometimes called the tree of life. The evolutionary theory rests upon the premise or belief that all living things evolved from a single ancestor here. Thus, it is the ancestral colonial protist that gave rise to all the animals today. And as time went on, they evolved and acquired evolutionary advantageous traits and gave rise to various different species like this. The colonial protist first gave rise to the sponges. Sponges are considered, with some degree of controversy apparently, to be the first animals. So here's that special protist, the choanoflagellate, and it has this fancy microvilli color like this. Now this over here is a light microscope image of choanoflagellates. 3 of them, I think. Thus, as I suggested, this unique protist, the choanoflagellate, is able to form colonies like you see before you over here. The reason they do this is because it has a survival advantage for them. They're able to filter living things surrounding them more efficiently. They're able to hunt for microorganisms such as bacteria, their food, in a more efficient way. And this gave rise to the earliest animals, the sponges. In fact, if you look at a sponge closely, and here's a cartoon representation of one, and if you examine one area very closely, you will see cells called choanocytes among other cells, which are an integral part of this organism. Is it by coincidence? Not according to the theory of evolution. Indeed, the choanocytes, the defining cells of the sponges among other cells, look very, very much like the choanoflagellate protist. They too have a microvilli collar and a flagellum like this. But unlike the choanoflagellate protist, the sponge has all the characteristics except one, that it's not mobile, of animals. It is a multicellular eukaryotic living thing that is a heterotroph that is able to digest other living things and has elements to protect itself. Thus, sponges are considered by most to be the earliest of the animals in the animal kingdom. Somewhere along the line, some of these sponges evolved further. Subsequent generations evolved even more. Now, one thing that's apparent when observing this tree is that there are some branching points. That is, something happens here, in this case, tissues are formed, and then something happens here, that is, bilateral symmetry is appreciated. At every branching point, there is some evolutionary breakthrough that occurs. If we understand these important evolutionary breakthroughs, these important branch points, then it is easier to make sense of the diversity of the animal kingdom. In this regard, I'd like to suggest that there are 6 important evolutionary milestones. That is, there are 6 important evolutionary landmarks or breakthroughs that have occurred, and each of these represent diverging points in the evolutionary tree. It's kind of like an important discovery that helped that living thing survive in its environment. The first we've already mentioned, that is multicellularity. A small colony of protists cannot really be considered like a multicellular living thing. But the sponges are. They can be quite big, as you can see. So the first evolutionary milestone was multicellularity. Well, that's wonderful, you say. See, plants are multicellular too. But there's more. The second great evolutionary milestone was the formation of tissues. See, a conglomerate of cells is not necessarily tissue. Tissue is specialization of a group of cells. For example, if you have cardiac muscle tissue, the cardiac muscle is very distinct, for example, than the central nervous system, the brain tissue, and it has evolved for its particular function. So when cells specialize, that's what we call tissue. So a tissue is a group of cells that work towards a more specialized purpose. And this differentiation of responsibility is what we mean by formation of tissues. This jellyfish, for example, forms from two specific germ layers, the ectoderm and the endoderm. Thus, the first great evolutionary milestone was the multicellularity. The second great evolutionary milestone was the formation of tissues. The third great evolutionary milestone or breakthrough was bilateral symmetry. See, this jellyfish is radially symmetrical, but this flatworm here is bilaterally symmetrical. That is, it has two halves that are mirror images. Now, bilateral symmetry has advantages in that the sense organs of the animals can be concentrated in the front end. It allows for a more efficient and expert use of sensory perceptions, and this definitely gives a survival advantage. So bilateral symmetry was a remarkable evolutionary milestone. And mind you, this bilateral symmetry does not exist in plants. The fourth thing is the development or the discovery of body cavities, or coeloms as they are called. Now, if you recall, the flatworm was an acoelomate. It did not have a body cavity, that there's no space between the ectoderm, mesoderm, and the endoderm. As I suggested, the first attempt at creating a body cavity didn't quite work and resulted in this formation of a pseudocoelomate, a cavity between the endoderm and the mesoderm, which doesn't quite work. But nevertheless, that's still better than nothing. The true cavity in the coelomates resides between the mesoderm itself, and it allows for internal organ development to occur. Now, the fifth great evolutionary milestone was the deuterostome development. Recall that animals can be classified as protostomes or deuterostomes, and this classification is based on the blastopore, the very initial pore that forms in the very early embryologic development. Now, here's the blastopore. If the blastopore goes on to become the mouth of the living thing, that's called a protostome. If the blastopore goes on to develop into the anus of the living thing, that's called a deuterostome. Well, what's the big deal, you say? The big deal is that this is a surrogate marker for the complexity of embryological development. That is, it's almost like a very different philosophy, a very different software for the development of the embryo. The deuterostome living things are much more complicated. It's almost like somewhere in the evolutionary line, a gene got turned on and said, wait a minute, let's try it this way. And the whole embryological development process changed. And finally, segmentation. The earthworm, of course, is a great example of a living thing that has segmentation. Segmentation allows for specialization. Different segments can evolve different functions. The circulatory system, for example, in this earthworm, can evolve into pumping vessels that develop into primitive hearts. Another advantage of segmentation is that it creates redundancy. That is, if part of the animal is damaged or lost, the animal perhaps can still survive. Also, segmentation allows greater mobility and independent movement of parts. Here's an example of another segmented animal. Here, some segments have evolved into mouth parts, and some have developed walking legs, some have evolved into swimming appendages, and some have evolved into antennae. So segmentation is another profound evolutionary milestone. Now, human beings are also segmented, although the segments are more difficult to see. But you can see over here clearly how different segments are supplied by different nerves. Thus, in summary, there are 6 main evolutionary milestones or breakthroughs. This includes development of multicellularity, evolution of tissues, bilateral symmetry, creation of body cavities, deuterostome embryological development, and finally, segmentation. If you appreciate these phenomena, the tree of life or the tree of living things, the phylogeny, becomes easier to understand. Okay, so this is how I see it. Long time ago, some colonial protists evolved into the sponges. and sponges were doing just fine for a long time, and some of them survived to this day. But somewhere along the line, an evolutionary breakthrough occurred, that is, the development of tissues. The development of tissues gave rise to the cnidarians, the jellyfish, and a host of his cousins. And of course, some of these living things still survive, but some of them then evolved bilateral symmetry. The first living things with bilateral symmetry, some of them primitive living things such as the flatworms. And now the flatworms were doing just fine for a long time, and some of them, of course, still exist. But then one day, another evolutionary breakthrough occurred. That is, they developed a body cavity. Now, granted, the first attempt at the body cavity was kind of like a pseudocoelom, right? This gave us the roundworms. This is not the true body cavity that they were aiming for, so to speak. But nevertheless, this was an evolutionary advancement. And by the way, the rotifers, which are tiny little things, are a branch of the roundworms. But these guys, the ones with the pseudocoelom, didn't give up. A second try, and they developed a true coelom, a true body cavity. And that gave rise to the first living things with true body cavities, the mollusks, which include the snail, etc. And as you can see already, the complexity of the living things increasing. And then some evolved segmentation. Yes, the earthworm indeed is definitely more complicated than the snail. It has a vascular system and everything. And this gave rise to the arthropods, that is, segmented living things with the exoskeleton, the most successful, at least in terms of number of species, among all living things. Okay, so that was very good. The mollusk was like a breakthrough, right? From there we got the segmented worms, and from there we got the arthropod, the most successful of all living things, in terms of at least the number of species. Okay, but then there was an evolutionary shift. See, all the living things thus far we've talked about, they were protostomes. The deuterostromes, which is like a different software, so to speak, for embryological development, gave rise to a new group of living things, the echinoderms, such as the starfish. Starfish, by the way, is not radially symmetrical. It is in its adult form, but early in its life, in fact, has bilateral symmetry. Nevertheless, echinoderms, which include starfish, they have an endoskeleton, and from this, if you add segmentation, this gave rise to the chordates. And vertebrates, animals that have backbones, just like ourselves, are a branch of chordates. As you can see, segmentation occurred at least twice here in the evolutionary line. It occurred here with the mollusks, before they decided to go deuterostome and gave rise to segmented worms, and they developed an exoskeleton give the arthropods. But look over here. But when the mollusks decided to go deuterostome, they gave rise to the echinoderms with endoskeleton, that is, skeleton inside the body. And to that, if you add segmentation, that gave rise to chordates, the most complex of all living things. And that is what is represented in this chart. Now, if you follow this chart, there's the colonial protist. It developed multicellularity, but without any true tissues, and this gave rise to sponges. Some sponges evolved true tissues, and that gave rise to the radially symmetrical cnidarians, including the jellyfish. And some of those evolved bilateral symmetry. Then that included the flatworms, which did their best to create a coelom, and the first effort resulted in the pseudocoelom creation of the roundworms. A branch of these is the rotifers. When they did make it, they made a true coelom. There were two branches, the protostomes and the deuterostomes. The true coelom mollusks, the protostomes, and the true coelom deuterostomes. The mollusks, as I suggested, evolved into the annelids, the segmented worms, and then they developed into the arthropods, which include the insects. Among the deuterostomes, we had the echinoderms, and some developed segmentation to give rise to the chordates. Now, of course, the evolutionary tree is much more complicated than this. This is a broad overview. But the sponges, the cnidarian, the flatworms, the roundworms, the rotifers, the mollusks, the annelids, the arthropods, the echinoderms, chordates, these represent the major phyla in the kingdom of Animalia. And we shall study each of these individually starting next time. Until then, as-salatu was-salamu ala rasulillah walhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum.